Hey guys, this is Alex. I'm glad to have you back. So in this video, we're going to take a look at arrow functions. And arrow functions are basically a new syntax in ES6 that allows you to work with functions in JavaScript in a more concise and clear way. So in order to illustrate the concept, let's say we have an array of languages, like programming languages. So we might have like JavaScript, let's say Python, and maybe Swift. So what you want to do is we want to loop through all the languages and we want to just return a simple message for each one of them. So what we might want to do is we might reassign languages to the result of the call to the map function. So the map function is basically a function on the array object that allows you to loop through all the elements of an array and apply some kind of a logic onto them. So in this case, the map function is going to expect a callback. In this case, we can just pass an anonymous function, and the first argument to that function would be the language. So in this case, it's just going to loop through all the elements in the array, JavaScript, Python, and Swift, and each string is basically going to be available through that parameter of lang or language. So in this case, what we want to do is, let's say we just want to return the language as well as a simple string rocks. And once that's done, we just want to console log all the languages. So in this case, we get 3 results, and it looks like I forgot the space. Okay, so we get JavaScript rocks, Python rocks, Swift rocks. So that's simple. Now, what's the idea with arrow functions? Now, arrow functions is basically nothing new. It's still the same functions, but basically they allow you to have a clearer syntax. So in this case, if we want to use arrow functions, what we might want to do is we might just remove the function keyword and instead add this sort of like an arrow, which is basically an equal sign and a greater than sign. So as you can see, it doesn't actually change any of the output. So it's the same result, it's just a different syntax for doing the same thing. And furthermore, because in this case we just have one argument, a language or lang, we don't actually need any parentheses around it, so we can just remove them completely. And this is what it looks like. So now arrow functions actually allow you to reduce this simple example even further. So you can see that as a function, every function basically has a body, right? And the body of the function is constrained to the curly braces. Now this is fine with traditional functions when you use a function keyword, but with arrow functions you can actually simplify this. So instead of having the curly braces, you can simply just remove them, and in this case we don't actually need any return keyword, so remove that, and what we end up with is basically the parameter, the arrow, and then the block of code that's going to execute, and then we can just bring this closing bracket on the same line. So this simplifies the previous example a lot. So we got rid of the function keyword, we got rid of the extra parentheses, the curly braces, and the return keyword. So this is very clean, nice, and succinct. Now in this example, we're using the map function. Now actually the map function allows you to have the second argument, which is the index of the element. So the index of the element would just be 0, 1, or 2, depending on what the element that you're looping through is. So in this case, it's not going to work because we don't have the parentheses. Now if you just have the one argument like we had before, the language, that's fine, but if you have more than one argument, you're going to need to have the parentheses. So that's why you have to put back the parentheses, right, like that. So we have the 2 arguments, we have the arrow function, and we have the logic basically on the same line. Now if you had more logic or processing to do, then you could still default back to the curly braces. In this case, make sure that you don't forget the return keyword. So we just want to return, let's say, language, and like we had before, rocks. So this is it. But in this case, it's a very simple operation. We're just taking the language and we're just adding a simple string to it. If it was something more complex, let's say you had some kind of variables inside, or you had other functions, or you wanted to do some kind of logic, then yeah, it makes sense to use the curly braces in order to have all of that code incorporated within the function, within the body of the function. Now in this case, it's fine. So we can just remove the curly braces. We can move the return to the top. Also remove this bracket to the top. Now in this case, don't forget that the return keyword is actually, it's not needed here. It's implicit. So we actually need to remove it like that. So in this case, the return keyword is implicit. Now, the interesting thing is you don't need to put the return keyword like I said. So let's say if you had something like console log language, well, we're going to get undefined. The reason we get that is because there's actually a return keyword that returns the result of console log. Now, console log, even if you try it in the browser, so I have the Chrome console log open right there. So if I do console log, I don't know, just full, you see the full right there because that's the output of the function, but you also see undefined. And undefined is basically what the function returns. So the log method on the console returns nothing. It basically returns undefined. So it just prints the value to the console, but it doesn't return any value. So in this case, we do have the implicit return, but it doesn't return anything, and that's why we're getting undefined. Now the other thing is, let's say you had to return some kind of an object instead of console logging it or returning the language with a string concatenated to it. So let's say you wanted to return some kind of an object. Maybe you want to say the name of the language would be the string that we provide in the function. So as you can see, that's not going to work. That actually returns undefined. And the way to basically fix it is to just add the extra parentheses right there, like so. So as you can see right there, we get three objects. One basically has a name of JavaScript, the other one Python, and the last one is Swift. So that's how you deal with objects. If you need to return an object from an arrow function, just make sure that you wrap it with the brackets. Now in this case, if you had a body of a function, if you wanted to do some kind of an extra logic within, then what you might do is, well, you're definitely going to need the return keyword, right? So you might just want to put the curly braces right there, so that's going to make an object for you. Then you put name, language, right? And that's going to return the same output as before right there. So that's basically it for arrow functions. Now, the only one last thing that you need to keep in mind, that you need to be aware of, is basically the way that arrow functions treat this keyword. Now, this keyword in JavaScript basically refers to the underlying object that you're working with. So in order to clarify this example, it would be useful to use JavaScript or ES6 classes. Now, we're going to take a look at classes in the very next video, but I don't want to introduce the concept just yet, so let's just use the traditional way of defining classes in JavaScript, which is basically using the function keyword. Now let's say we have some kind of a class, let's say person. Now a person might have a first name, and let's say they also have hobbies. So nothing fancy here, just a simple function. Now instead of doing any processing or logic within it, we're going to define this keyword dot first name. That's basically going to create a property on that function, on that object that's going to be instantiated with that function. So that's just going to be equal to the first name, and then we might have this hobbies equals hobbies. Those are just the two parameters or arguments that we passed. And let's say this this class will also have some kind of a behavior. Let's say list hobbies, which is basically just going to list all the hobbies that this person has. So this would be a function, right? So we just assign a function to a property. And, well, what do we want to do? Let's say we want to return this dot hobbies. So this would be a reference to the person object. Now, it's going to make more sense once we actually instantiate it, which we're going to do in a second. But for now, let's just do this, this hobbies. And in this case, let's say we just want to map through them. And like before, we're going to pass a callback function with the argument that's basically going to be the hobby of that person. Now, the only thing we want to do is, let's say we just want to do a simple console log and say that this dot first name, referring to the first name of the person object, plus loves, and then the name of the hobby. Now, so far so good, no errors in the console. So let's say we want to create an instance of this class, right? So let's say we have let person equals new person. We're basically initializing this class right there. And the first name would be, let's say, Alex. And for hobbies, well, let's say working out, let's say coding, and lastly, meditation, because I like to meditate. Now this will be it. And so we just want to go ahead and call the list hobbies method on that object. Now in this case, we have an interesting behavior here. So we're actually getting undefined 3 times. Now this undefined actually comes from here. So we're trying to call first name on the this keyword, and it's not really clear as to what's going on. So let's say we were debugging this code. Let's say we didn't know what was going on, and we tried to console log the this keyword. Now in this case, we can't see it in the console log in CodePen, but we can actually see it in the browser. So let's just take a look there, and you can see that the output of the this keyword gives us the window object. Now this is a standard behavior in JavaScript. It's a little bit tricky, and you just gotta keep it in mind. But basically, the this keyword inside a function, because like we talked in the previous video, a function has its own scope, right? So the this keyword actually doesn't make sense within that function. That's just how traditional functions in JavaScript work. So this returns the window object. Now actually the trick is, if we use the Babel preprocessor like I showed you in the previous video, that's going to change the behavior. So if we try that, now we actually get an error here because it says cannot read property first name of undefined. And we also get the undefined keyword right there. So the this keyword within this function, within this anonymous function, is going to be undefined if we turn on the Babel preprocessor, right? But if I turn it off, like before, we're going to get the window object. The reason we get undefined for the first name, well, that's just simply because the window object doesn't have any first name property defined on it. Now, let's say if we used, instead of having the first name as a property in the class, let's say instead we created a property called name, and we tried to console log that name. Now, in this case, it's going to give us an interesting result. It says CodePen loves working out. And the reason is, somehow CodePen basically creates a property on the window object that refers to the name of the website that we're on. Now in this case, we don't get anything, but if you try that within the CodePen console, as you might expect, you're going to get CodePen. So that's the reason why that's happening. So this might be a little bit confusing. Now, like I said, this behavior is very tricky, and if you don't know about it, it can really mess you up. In this case, the arrow functions will come to the rescue. So instead of using the traditional function keyword, and let's just put back the first name just for more clarity. So instead of using the function keyword, let's just use arrow functions, and let's see what happens with that. Now this gives us the proper output, so we get all of the 3 statements with the proper first name of the object. Now in this case, it's Alex because we passed Alex as the first argument. So now this is how arrow functions work. So basically, they allow you to have access to the this keyword that in this case refers to the person object from within the function. So the function right here, the anonymous function that we pass, it keeps the same reference to the this keyword, so we don't have to do anything extra in order to get access to it. So, but let's say you wanted to use the old approach with the functions. Well, it's still possible to get this working without using arrow functions. So one typical approach would be to have a separate variable. So you could either use var or you can use let. And a typical name would be self. So you assign this object to the self variable, and instead of using this, you basically just use self. So as you can see, it's going to work perfectly. So you get all the 3 statements with the first name. The other approach is, instead of doing that, you can still keep this keyword, but you could also use the bind method on the function. So basically every function, and that's the other thing about functions. Functions are actually objects. So every object has a method on it that you can basically call, like arrays have methods, strings have methods. Well, functions are also objects, just like arrays and strings, so you can call methods on them. So in this case, you can call a special method that's called bind, and it basically allows you to bind, in this case, it allows you to bind the this keyword to the context or the scope of the function. So the this keyword that we're passing into bind, well, this is the same this keyword that exists within this function, right? So you're passing it there, it's going to be the reference to the person object, and in this case we get the proper output in the console. And the very last approach, because we're using map actually allows you to pass a second argument to it. So if you pass this to it, it allows you to basically get this working within the context of the function. To make it clear, let's just look at the documentation of map in JavaScript. Now if you go to Mozilla Docs, you're basically going to see this this box right there that tells you all about the syntax, and you can see that the second argument is actually the this keyword. The this argument, the this arg parameter allows you to pass the this keyword so that you can get the access to the underlying object within the callback function, right? So going back to our example, we have this function right here. So when we pass this to it, it allows you to have access to the this keyword that exists within this function, which is basically the person object. So all this is kind of tricky and requires extra logic to do. In this case, the simplest solution is to just use arrow functions. So in this case, we can just refactor the code in the following way and just remove the function keyword. In this case, it works, but you can simplify it even further. Because we just have one argument, we can remove the brackets, right? So we get the same proper output. Now, if you had more arguments, like I said, if you wanted to have access to the index that the map function provides, you're going to have to add the brackets back. So this is basically it for arrow functions. I hope you liked the video, and I hope to see you next time.